We've had Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in the last couple of days saying a little key, actually advised the president, maybe not such a good idea to try to get this guy out before his term ends in May. Just let it roll on, let it happen naturally, as it were, because they're already, if I'm not mistaken, I think two of Trump's people on the FOMC already, and I think you've got a couple of seats that are going to come open, and I think the strategy could be to look for it to happen naturally, so they have a majority of their people, as it were. Does that make sense to you? Is that what is likely to happen, do you think?
Well, so I think there's a stumbling block or two there. So I think it would be very, very unwise to try and remove the Fed chair before their term is up. Aside from anything else, it's not just the question of central bank independence, it's also the question of rule of law in that situation, because I don't think there is something which would be presented as a credible legal justification for removing. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so in that situation, if you're starting to say, well, maybe the rule of law doesn't hold in the United States, do you really want to be holding your reserve assets in somewhere where the rule of law is questionable? Maybe not. So I think on many levels that would be problematic. Now, the issue here, one of the big questions is, does Powell resign as a governor as well as Fed chair? Because he's got until 2028 as a governor. He can stay on as a governor. And so the fact that he is almost certain going to lose the role of Fed chair means he may not have to resign as a governor. He may choose to stay on. Interestingly, we have all this furore about the cost of renovating the Eccles building in Washington. Yeah. The Eccles building is named after a Fed chair who stayed on in office after he lost his position as Fed chair. He remained as a governor. Oh. So Powell may not disappear. He may still be around on the FOMC.
Yeah. You've made comments about how, it would not be useful if the next Fed chair ended up being somebody like Arthur Burns, right? Who was the Fed chair during the Nixon administration, right? Because on the surface he would be, I guess, acceptable, but in actual fact it would end up being simply just literally a spokesperson for somebody like Trump.
Exactly. So we've got a spectrum here. You've got somebody completely independent, a Bernanke, a Yellen, somebody like that. Markets will love that. Complete political stooge, absolute political puppet. Again, that's not so damaging because the FOMC will just ignore them. If you put a complete idiot in charge of the Federal Reserve, then they will just, the rest of the Fed will just outvote them, and then they've got very little influence. The thing about Arthur Burns was he had been critical of Nixon and had criticised several aspects of his policy. But at the end of the day, when you look at the Fed minutes, the detailed Fed minutes from that period, and you look at the transcripts from the White House, the Oval Office meetings, basically Burns was just parroting what Nixon had told him to say, and so he had this superficial air of independence, so the Fed didn't oppose him, or at least not until very late in the day, but then he was actually just a political mouthpiece. That would be the worst case scenario, I think, for financial markets.
What about the front runner right now, who seems to be Kevin Warsh?
So that's an interesting question because, of course, he has been a governor. He's used to the institution. I think he possibly understands the need to build a consensus and so on and so forth. I may not agree with his economic ideas. I rarely agree with other economists. But there's an issue there where I think he probably has enough institutional gravitas that he would continue to assert the independence of the Fed. He may well be advocating for rate cuts, but he knows he's got to bring the rest of the committee along with him. And I think, to be honest, by the time we're talking about in April, May of next year, we are going to be looking at rate cuts anyway, because by that point, I think the weakening of the US economy under the burden of these trade taxes is going to be sufficient that the Fed will be then looking to cut almost regardless of who is chair.
The rule of law. I'm not going to say that Trump is going to try to weaponize the law, although a lot of people think he is already in many different instances. But and this whole issue of firing Powell for cause, which is the only reason that he could. This whole thing about the Eccles building, right? Cost overrun, $700 billion. He could actually end up getting Powell on a technicality like that, where, yes, I mean, legally, he is on the wrong side of the law. What happens then?
Well, so the thing is, building costs overrun all the time. I've got building work going on at home at the moment, and the builders seem to go to sleep every night dreaming up ways of adding zeros to the cost sheet. So, this is something that happens all the time, and I think it would be very, very difficult, given that 2/3 of federal building projects have overrunning costs in the last few years. Okay. Very, very difficult to argue this in a credible way. Now, he might be able to argue and get away with it legally. It doesn't matter legally. The whole thing about central banks is its confidence, its perception. Okay. If markets don't have confidence that the central bank is being treated as an independent institution, if they don't perceive the central bank as acting independently, then restoring that confidence is not something that happens overnight. That takes years, maybe even decades to achieve. So that, I think, would be the issue. I mean, look how long it took Volcker to restore credibility to the Federal Reserve after Arthur Burns and the damage that had happened in the 1970s. I don't think that this is something that, saying you've got cause and actually having cause, that distinction really matters.
Okay, trust hard to build, easy to destroy. I get the point.